I'd like to welcome you to the first repatriation session of the morning. We're going to be following up after the break this morning with part two with Harold Jacobs, Irene Dundas, and Bob Sam. This one will introduce the topic, and unfortunately our first two speakers, Judy and Elaine, were not able to make it into Juneau, so we're going to have to improvise a little bit. We do have Emily Moore here, and also Terry Fifield was not able to make it, but he sent in a narrated PowerPoint for me to show you, which I'm looking forward to, about the On Your Knees cave repatriation. And what I thought I'd do to fill in a little bit would be to show the PowerPoint that Harold Jacobs and I did yesterday on the use of historical photos in research and repatriation, which we didn't get all the way through yesterday. And I see Harold is there in the back. If you'd like to join me for part two of that, that would be great. First of all, my name is Steve Henrikson. I work at the Alaska State Museum, and I also am very interested in Northwest Coast Native art, especially Tlingit art, and have come to, over the years, really appreciate not only the artistic qualities of the at.oow, but their meaning, and that's a lot of that enters into work on repatriation, because so much of dealing with the repatriation has to do with the meaning of the objects. And I just wanted to give a brief overview of what repatriation is for anyone who isn't already familiar with it. In the early 90s, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that did a number of things, part of which concern archaeological excavations and how they are conducted. And these are regulations that apply to excavations on federal land. And also there's a section that applies to museums that has to do with artifacts, not only ones that were excavated, but ones that were collected over the years. And it applies to any museums that receive federal funding, which is practically all the museums, because any time you get a federal grant, that counts as receiving federal funds. So it applies to most public museums in the United States. The Smithsonian was exempted because they have their own repatriation policy that in various ways is similar to NAGPRA, and so they follow a similar path to dealing with repatriation claims. What we're looking at today is the part of the law that specifically relates to repatriation from museums, and also Terry's program is about the human remains issue and how they dealt with that in a very famous case from Prince of Wales Island, On Your Knees Cave. The NAGPRA is a very challenging law to work with, because it's in a number of ways it's a very unique piece of legislation, and even legal experts are divided on how to interpret various parts of it, and there hasn't been that many test cases in the courts to actually work through some of these gray areas. So there's still, even though we're over a decade past the passage of the law, there's still a lot of questions remaining about what certain things mean. They tried to make one law fit all the tribes in the United States, and there's over 700 federally recognized tribes in the U.S. that have standing to file claims, and about 500 of those are in Alaska. So it's even more complicated here. And in the lower 48, it's clearer as to which tribe has jurisdiction. In Alaska, the law recognizes both IRA councils and tribal governments, as well as native corporations, as both having standing. So you have areas of overlapping coverage that sometimes leads to confusion and in some cases disputes over which tribe is more affiliated to an object than another. So it makes it even more complicated on top of it. But specifically in the law, there's 4 classes of objects that can be repatriated from museums. There's human remains, of course, and there's usually no dispute over whether something is a human remain or not, although there have been some cases where, for instance, if there was human hair on an artifact, does that count as a human remain? And the regulations say that if it was shed voluntarily and put on an art object, it isn't classified as human remains. A second category is funerary object, and that's something that was purposefully placed with a burial or with human remains and meant to stay put there. And usually by the documentation you can identify whether it's a funerary object or not. There was a question about, in Tlingit country, there is a tradition of taking photographs of deceased members of the clan laid out with all the at.oow, and there was some thought that maybe those objects would qualify as funerary because they were in this funeral setting, and there was lots of photographs that actually could be evidence of that. But the rule is that it would be objects that would go with the body to its final resting place. So those wouldn't qualify as funerary objects. But they certainly could apply to one or both of the other 2 categories under NAGPRA. There's sacred objects, and a sacred object is something that's needed by living Native Americans for the conduct of traditional religions, and basically a religious leader within a federally recognized tribe just has to identify what is needed, and that's a sacred object. So that's pretty cut and dry. The final classification, though, is a little bit fuzzier, and that's the category of cultural patrimony. And this would be an object that has ongoing historical and cultural significance that is owned by a group of people as opposed to an individually owned object. So that would seem to include any of the at.oow because it's a group-owned object that has cultural and historical significance. And at.oow would probably also qualify in most cases as a sacred object because it's involved with sacred ceremonies, and spirits surround those objects on occasion, and so they could very well be claimed as a sacred object as well. In establishing a claim for an object, a tribe needs to prove that with evidence, a preponderance of evidence, that an object fits in one of those categories, one or more. They have to show that the tribe claiming it has standing to file the claim. And finally, if they prove those 2 things, the burden of proof shifts to the museum to show that they have a right of possession. And a right of possession only applies, I believe, to sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony. It doesn't apply to human remains or funerary objects. The right of possession is that the museum would show with evidence that they have a valid right to possess the object that was obtained through whatever mechanism in the traditional Native American law that applied at the time something was collected. So that becomes another issue for debate, is what laws or principles were in play at a particular time something left the Native community. And that I found is a real fuzzy area because there's just not a huge amount of, for one thing, there weren't very many people writing down what the Tlingit law was 100 years ago, and also there are quite a few differences of opinion among cultural experts as far as what rules may have been in place at some time in the past. It's one thing to say, well, 20 years ago, a lot of us were around and would have firsthand knowledge of it. But in other cases, if it is something that left the native community 100 years ago or more, it becomes, there's less and less various kinds of evidence to really show what was in play. So it can be a real daunting task to research through these claims and try to make sense of it. So what we'll start out with today is a presentation that Harold and I worked on for the session on historical photos yesterday that we didn't get all the way through. This one is about using historical photographs to research claims and also what they can prove or disprove about an object. Now, NAGPRA says you can use all manner of evidence, oral tradition, historical photos, anthropological writing, interviews. There's just any number of types of information that you can use in a claim. Historical photos are very useful, but there's limitations to what they can and cannot do. Even photos are subject to interpretation, and they can be misleading sometimes. So the presentation that we did yesterday shows some of the cases that have come up, and it'll just give you an introduction to the use of historical photos in putting together repatriation claims. For historical research, illustrations are extremely useful, and also later on photographs, but photography didn't really come into Alaska much until the 1880s. There were a few photographers up here prior to that, but they were few and far between. So it's really the 1880s, 1890s when you start to get a number of photographers up here working. Before that, much of our visual history of the Tlingit culture comes from illustrations like this. This was done by a Russian artist in the 1840s, showing the funeral of a chief in Sitka, and there's in the scene there, there's a shaman playing a drum, and there's people dressed in button robes with staffs on the left-hand side. The chief himself is lying in state against the back wall of the house, surrounded by chilkat robes. He's wearing a shakiet. There's a tena leaning up beside him, and there's a pile of Chinese chests with other at.oow on the top of them. So an illustration like this, even though it was done by a Russian who probably had very limited understanding of what he was seeing, there's still a very rich amount of information here, and it's loaded with all kinds of really great things. I didn't notice this until recently, that across the top of the house they draped yards and yards of trade cloth, and maybe that was something that would be distributed at some point when the Kuik took place. But we see in the early photography, we see some scenes that imitate some of those, what you see in the early drawings. This is a photo of a group of dancers that are holding similar staffs that have, it almost looks like tree branches tied onto the top of them. And I'm not sure exactly what the occasion was in this case, but this was a photo that is in the museum in Victoria, and it's really, from this, it's really not clear what community this is from, but there's another version of the same photo that wasn't cropped that's in the Glenbow Museum in Canada that isn't cropped, and on the side, on one of the sides, you can see a Russian blockhouse, so that must be Sitka. So it really pays to, a lot of times certain photos were reproduced quite often, and they've ended up in a lot of different museums, so it really pays to track down all of the existing photos, as many as you can, because sometimes important details are cropped off the edges. This is a photograph that is often attributed to Emmons, but I've also seen other photographers' names on them. There was a lot of piracy between photographers in those days, and whoever took this photo, it's really a rare one because it shows, Emmons said that what was happening in this case was it was a berry feast in Sitka. Some people were coming in for a berry feast, and they took bolts of trade cloth and unrolled them and hoisted them above their canoe with sticks to make like a multicolored rainbow over the top of them, which I think I'd like to see that someday. I don't know that if this has been done in recent years or not. This photo was taken in the 1890s at Sitka. And a photo like this is just loaded with all kinds of information. And Harold yesterday went through and named almost every person in this photo, and many of the objects he's tracked down in various museums. Some of them are still in the hands of one of the Angoon clans. This is mostly people from Angoon that were attending the 1904 potlatch. And there's a few of these I can speak to. This particular Shuká here was in the National Museum of the American Indian, and that was repatriated about 10 years ago due to Harold's efforts. This one is being returned from the same museum, this wolf headdress. There's, let's see, this one is the dragonfly headdress from Angoon, and that one was purchased by a collector and donated to at.oow Corporation, and they still own it. It's stored at the State Museum, and when elders need it for ceremonies, they take it out of there. And anyway, there's dozens of major pieces of at.oow from several different clans in this photo, and Harold has managed to track down every one of them, plus he's managed to identify everyone in the photo practically. He also talked about this pretty unique event at this particular potlatch was the dragonfly puppet there that's held on the porch, and I guess there's there's 3 people underneath that are holding it up, and the wings were able to flap separately, and Harold said that they weren't too sure how this would go over at the potlatch because it was such a new idea, but I guess it went over pretty well. And this was in 1904. We have a rich visual record of this particular potlatch because it was supposedly going to be the last potlatch. Governor Brady had pressured some of the Sitka clan leaders to stop potlatching, and they told them that they couldn't just give it up without paying off the other side. So he said, okay, well, I'll have one last one and get it over with, and then that's it. So at least some of the people in here may have been thinking that this truly was the last one. In reality, of course, it wasn't, but there were several photographers that took pictures at this event, and they probably were under the impression that this was going to be the last one, so they did a really good job documenting it. And we can be grateful for that, and also grateful that it wasn't the last potlatch. But another interesting thing about this photo, at least I find it interesting, is that in this photo and others, some of the people are wearing their Chilkat robes with the fringe up, and I was always curious about that, so I would consistently ask elders if they had ever had any idea what that meant. One of them said that they thought it was a sign of protest because they did not go along with the idea that this was going to be the last potlatch, and they were showing that they didn't go along with it, except that same phenomenon shows up in photos from other ceremonies, so that may or may not be true. Another elder, actually the daughter of one of the hosts of this particular party, said that they did that whenever they were about to do something big. That was a sign that something big was about to happen. So another photo, this is from the 1890s, a photo of guests coming into a gathering in Klukwan or near Klukwan, and these are, I think, Kagwantan, and one of them is wearing, these are guests in their canoes about to land on shore, and one of the, right here, this person is wearing a shark war helmet that is now in the Field Museum in Chicago. And there's also several of the people carrying rifles there that, to what would normally be thought of as a peaceful gathering, it's curious that they would have weapons drawn and someone was even wearing armor, but that probably has to do with the practice of when guests arrived that you kind of challenge them as if you thought they might be an incoming enemy, and then you find out who they are, and then you invite them ashore. And this might have been in that initial phase when they were challenging the guests, and the guests had their guns at the ready, but those were quickly put away. The drawings, initially some of the Russians' drawings and then later on historical photos really document the transition of the appearance of these native towns, the shift from traditional style architecture to introduced types of architecture, but just like Eamon said, where the clan survives its mere structure, just because the houses shifted over to the Western style of architecture, they were still laid out inside in a way that would still allow them to be used for traditional gatherings. This is a drawing from Sitka, 1840s, again, showing the traditional post and beam framed houses with board coverings and a smoke hole in the ceiling. And then, let's see, along that side is a palisade that the Russians built to separate the native community from the Russian part of the community. This is photos of house construction are really rare. This is the only one I've ever found of a Tlingit house being constructed, showing the process of hoisting one of the roof beams up on top of a post. There's a whole line of men there pulling on a rope, and a guy on top of the post that's ready to probably block it in place once it lands on the top of the post. Looks like a pretty precarious operation. And then that would serve as the main structure for the house, and then secondary beams and posts were put in at the corners, and then the whole thing covered with planking. Because of the limitations, the technical requirements of photography in this period, it's fairly rare that you have photos of the insides of the houses. The lighting was especially difficult in there, with most of the light coming in the smoke hole in the ceiling, and at times they were probably using some of that flash powder that they would put up on a little stand, and it would actually be a little explosion that would illuminate the room. So that they are fairly rare, and in most cases the people, if there are any people in those photos, they're sitting really still because they had to have the shutter open a long time, and that's why in a lot of these the people are blurry, because you can't really hold still. If you saw Ron Klein's demonstration yesterday, he pointed out that in a studio context, the photographers actually clamped your head in a little device so that you wouldn't move, but these obviously weren't done in a studio. But I find these photos really interesting, just to get a sense of the way the houses were used, what activities were done in them. And this, you can see they were busy cooking a meal there on the fireplace, and in the background you can see various beds laid out, and that's a pretty traditional way where the people would sleep along the exterior walls. A few pieces of European style furniture in there. This is 1888, I believe this photo was taken. Harold talked about this photo showing the clan houses, and Harold has done a exemplary job in talking to elders about many of these photos and identifying the people, and even in this case, the houses. This is the row of houses along in Angoon there, and he's named every one of them. And then the little structures in back are, of course, the grave houses. There's actually one of the only totemic sculptures in Angoon shows up in this photo, and I'll show you a picture of it a little bit later. It's right there. This is a photo of one of the clan houses in Klukwan in the McBride Museum, and they identify this as the Frog House, which makes sense because the Frog House was located close to where there was a graves of clansmen back behind, and one of them had their crest on it, the frog coming out on one of the grave houses. So this is in about the right location, I would think. David, does that conform to your research?
That part of the mountain when you start going past where Galahad used to be, but line it up, I guess.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to see if this is truly the Frog House or one of them. There's houses were built and torn down over the years, so sometimes it's challenging to figure out which house is which. These are some winter and pond photos of the older style of Frog House when they still had a roof held up by post and beam. And this is two of their famous frog house posts, and these were taken 1890s. This was taken around the turn of the century, and this is the next generation of house where they rebuilt the house in the western, partly in the western style. You can see the sawed lumber there that was used for the ceiling joists. Instead of having a beam that held up the roof, you had the walls of the structure supported the roof. But we were at the State Museum. We researched the history of the Frog House, especially the photographs, because we wanted to try to recreate at least the feeling of the original Frog House. And we went back and found all these photos, and we interviewed elders from there, including Mary King was our chief consultant on this, because she had been told by her elders what this house looked like, and not only this one but the one before it, when they still had the traditional style house. And she said that when they rebuilt this house, they repainted the house posts to make them look better and to stand out more. In this photo taken a little bit before, you can see that the paint doesn't really show up all that much. By that point, it was probably pretty worn off and wasn't very bright looking, so they repainted that. Also, this is truly a hybrid type of a house, because even though they have ceiling joists in the Western style, they still have a retaining wall, which was a feature of the old houses. They were always excavated down at least one or two steps, and they've done that in this case. And instead of an open fire in the middle of the floor, they put in a wood-burning stove, which also shows up in this photo, which is an extremely rare scene of a ceremony in the house. It's a miracle that this exists, and there's actually a dancer holding an adze right here. There's the adze, and that's why he's a little bit blurry, and then everybody else is watching the action there. You can see part of the wood stove. There's the chimney, and you can tell that they're not burning any wood right now because a child is sitting on top of the stove, which normally wouldn't be a good place to sit. But some of the versions of this photo have been cropped off on the sides, and so looking at those, you wouldn't know that this was one house from another. But luckily, in the very far right-hand corner, you can see a very small part of one of the frog house posts. So from that, we knew we knew that which house that was, and it makes a great companion for this photo because it shows another, the fragment of the house post that you see in that last one is from this one, and because of that you have two photos that link together. And I was talking to David about the possibility of making a 3D model of the house using those two photos, because you've got at least half of the house there that you could make a computerized model of it. And this is yet another photo of the inside of the frog house, and we know that again because there's, back in this area you can just barely make out one of the frog house posts. Yes?
What would you say the dimensions of the house are?
You know, that's something I haven't worked out, but just judging from, you know, we know the exact dimensions of the frog house post, so we could figure that out pretty easily. I've never done it, but I would guess that across the width of the house would be on the order of 40 to 50 feet, this particular version. And so I would guess that the house was approximately that deep too, a similar width and depth. But this particular house stood until the 1980s, and there's other photos of the outside of it that would give us the outside dimensions at least. So that would probably be the best way to go about it. But anyway, thank you. Just briefly, this photo was taken by a surveyor named Pratt, who went through the Chilkat Valley in the 1890s, I believe, and he said of this photo that he stopped in, and the owners of the house had just returned from a trapping and trading trip to the interior, and they had a whole bunch of animal furs that were hanging up to dry. That's why those furs are on the line. And also there's two Chilkat looms in the photo, and one of which is actively being woven on. They kept unlike a lot of the weavers today who have their whole weaving uncovered when they're working on it, the weavers of that period kept the weaving covered up quite a bit to keep it from getting dirty from the soot from the fire. This is the resulting exhibit at the State Museum that we did based on these historical photos and also Mary King's help. And she had given us a lot of her remembrances about what the elders said that old houses looked like. And when she came into this exhibit, she told us that we hit the nail on the head as far as creating something that really conformed to what her elders said the old house looked like. I just wanted to run through a few cases now of things that of Harold's work mostly, but I've done well where we've located old objects in museums and in private collections that show up old photos that help us identify what clan or at least what person was involved with it. And this is last year, this beaded neck piece showed up at an auction, and as a standard operating procedure, we consult with the clans on what things are before the museum acquires them. Now we want to make sure that we're not trying to acquire something that belongs to a clan, for instance. So I asked Harold if he knew where this was from, and he said it looked familiar, but he wasn't sure. And he didn't get back to us, and the auction was happening, so we just said, okay, we're going to go ahead and bid on it, and we'll work out the details later. And we actually were able to purchase this at auction, and the very next day Harold found it in an old photo being worn by Alex Andrews of Sitka, Kagwantan, and that's the very same neck piece. And this is the full photo of it. So sometimes these objects don't show up very large in the photo, and that behooves you to try to get the best available copy of it so it's as clear as possible. And then later, I was looking through some even older photos. That last one was from the 60s, I believe, 50s or 60s. This one is a Sobolev photo from the late 1800s or early 1900s, which seems to show the same neck piece being worn by a Kagwantan man. And he's the the photo on the left is off of the Alaska Library's website called Vilda. Have you guys looked at that yet? That's a really rich resource, but they have thousands of photos up on it, and you can search by any topic you want, and there's a tremendous amount there. But the photos that are online they are limited as to their resolution, and so if you want detail, you have to go call the library and ask them to re-scan it at a higher resolution. And on the left here is the Vilda version of that photo, and I asked them for a new scan of just that part of the photo, and it improved it enough to be able to say that yes, that indeed that is the same as that neck piece that we saw. You can even, when it's at a higher resolution, you can even count the number of feathers on the wing, and that matches exactly to the one that was at the auction. So our solution to that problem was just to contact the clan, and they made arrangements just to pay the auction house, and they were able to get their property back that way by paying for it, unfortunately. So a few other, I mean, there's so many images that you can analyze like this, but just a few of them. This is another 1904 potlatch mainly of Chilkat people. There you can tell there's some Gunnektadi. They're wearing their at.oow, and one of the men there is wearing a frog, what appears to be a frog shirt. The man there in the center with the right here, that shirt, and that one shows up again in this photo. The man in that case is wearing a mask, and this shows what the shirt looks like. And this is a great illustration of what Bill Holm was talking about yesterday, with the difference in the old type of photography with modern film. That it doesn't read color as you would expect. Some colors go dark and other colors go light, and in this case it's a red shirt, so that looks darker in the old photo than you would expect, and also the blue is lighter than you would expect, so it makes the object look different than what you'd expect, and that's something you have to take into consideration when you're analyzing these old photos. This is the first hat that was repatriated to a Tlingit clan under the Repatriation Act. That's the Yunyadi wolf hat that came from the Anchorage Museum, and it was returned to the clan in the early 90s. And this is a picture of an elder lying in state wearing that hat. And this is an Kwan. I'm not sure which clan it is now, but this is there's a dancer there wearing this shukiet. The way it looks now, it's lost the headdress form that once went on the back, but you can still tell it's the same outfit. Chief Sheikh's house from Wrangell. This is a real gold mine for trying to attribute, if there's a question about what clan something comes from. Photos like this or funeral photos where at.oow is laid out, it really allows you to make some connections there that are really important as far as a repatriation claim. This is a Chilkat robe from the Nanyayi that was repatriated recently, actually, from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. This is now back in Wrangell. This is a Wrangell leader wearing a hat which, if you look closely, it appears to be this frog hat. This is in the Oakland Museum today. This is one of Harold's, in my opinion, one of his most spectacular connections. This is a photograph of the interior of Winter and Pond's curio shop in Juneau, and there's a lot of these objects were made for sale to non-natives, but there's a few original objects that were meant for the Tlingit people in there that Winter and Pond somehow got a hold of, and one of them is this really neat, what appears to be a wolf hat with a silhouette of a head canoe on the top. And I looked for years to try to find this, never did, but Harold managed to find it without its canoe. Somehow that piece had turned up missing, but this is that same hat that's in the NMAI, the Smithsonian. Back to this photo again. Actually, I want to speed up a little bit here. This is the killer whale dagger that was another piece that Harold was involved with returning in the 1990s to the Ducklow AD. There's a photo of a man lying in state here with the dagger laid across his chest, and there's a lot of detail in here that's of interest. We're not sure where, at least I'm not sure where this hat ended up, but it's pretty interesting. This one here, it's got sea lion whiskers that are attached to the brim and a stack of potlatch rings, or so-called potlatch rings, on the top. Also, if you notice, another unique thing that is in the photo is the chilkat robe has ermine skins sewn onto the top of the fringe. And Harold, I don't know how many times I've seen this photo, but Harold noticed that detail after a long time. He said, "Look at that," and couldn't believe we had missed that before. Here's a Shukiet that was repatriated from the Logan Museum of Anthropology to the Take Wadey of Angoon. That's the old photos from the 1904 potlatch. This is that totem pole I was telling you about. This was a mascot for I think it was the University of Denver, or one of the universities in Colorado. They don't really know when this was taken out of Angoon, but it ended up at this university in Colorado where they had it as a mascot for the university. They called it Totem Teddy. And I think Harold eventually tracked this down, and they returned it to Angoon. And that's an enlargement of that photo that I showed you earlier, that you can barely make out the teddy on the top. It's Take Wadey. And this, Harold found this a totem, a canoe prow figure in the American Museum of Natural History that he'd always heard about the beaver canoe, and it figures prominently in the story of the bombardment of Angoon when the Navy burned the village, and the beaver canoe was the only canoe that survived that. And because it survived, the people were able to survive that winter, and they used it for subsistence. And then after that, the beaver canoe became a very special canoe for them, and they had this put this carved prow piece on it, and which went missing long ago, and nobody really remembered what happened to it. And it ended up going into the museum in New York, and it wasn't properly cataloged, so they didn't even really have it listed as a Tlingit object. And when Harold was back there with a delegation of clan leaders from Angoon, he asked to see their aisle of unidentified objects, and he went down it, and he walked past this, and only the face of this was showing the way they had it on the shelf, and he walked past it once, and then he said, "Something looks familiar," and he turned around and looked at it again, and then he suddenly realized what this was. And there's actually one old photo of the beaver canoe with the prow figure that was taken by Sobolev, and that allowed him to identify then what this was and where it was from, and that was repatriated about 10 years ago. There's a few, I want to skip past these. There's a lot of stories here that I could go into, but we do have a few other presentations. So I'll end it with that. And our next presentation will be Terry Fifield of the Forest Service talking about the project to excavate, research, and return the remains of the human remains, the Tlingit human remains from Prince of Wales Island, from the site known as On Your Knees Cave. And I will get this started, and I'll let Terry narrate it.
On Your Knees Cave and the Shuká honor ceremony, presented by Terry Fifield, Forest. Sorry that I'm not there, and I hope the technology is working well. I want to thank the organizers of the Sharing Our Knowledge conference for allowing me to submit this presentation in a PowerPoint and get this information across to you, even though I can't be there. So I hope to talk to you about this in person at some point, but thank you to the people of Juneau, and thank you to the organizers for allowing me to be part of this wonderful 3 days of presentations and sharing of knowledge. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about On Your Knees Cave and the work that's been done out there since 1996, when archaeological remains were first found. But really what I want to do is bring you up to date with what's happened in the last 2 years since I last talked to you about this in Sitka at the 2007 Clan Conference. At that time we had finished the studies and we had received a request under NAGPRA for the return of the objects and human remains from On Your Knees Cave, and I really want to bring you up to date on what's happened with all that. So let me tell you the story briefly and then bring you up to date. First, of course, here's the location. We're on Prince of Wales Island, down in the south end of the panhandle of Alaska. And On Your Knees Cave is on the northwestern tip of Prince of Wales Island. Some of the later events, the Shuká honor ceremony, took place in Klawakin Craig on the west coast of the island. The beginnings of discoveries at On Your Knees Cave came out of timber sale surveys, and as part of timber sale planning these days, or for the last 15 years, the Tongass has done surveys looking for important caves and karst features of the landscape where important things might be in caves. And so the teams working for Harza Inc., doing those surveys for the Forest Service, actually discovered On Your Knees Cave in 1992. And the cave is located right up there near Point Baker on the northwest tip of Prince of Wales Island. And it was located, the cave was located right near a planned road corridor. The picture on the left there is what the cave entrance looked like before the brush was cleared away. And on the right there is a picture of me standing in the cave after some of the brush was cleared away in early 1997. As I said, the discovery was in 1992. The mapping was in 1993, and the cave was named On Your Knees Cave by Kevin Allred in 1993. And in 1994, Tim Heaton began doing some study of the cave. Tim was looking at animal bones. He's a paleontologist with the University of South Dakota. But one of the first bones that he recovered from the cave were these bear leg bones, brown bear, 36,000 years old, and a black bear, over 41,000 years old. That was in 1994. Intriguingly old bear bones for southeast Alaska. So Tim came back in 1995, and again in 1996. And in 1996, towards the end of his project, he discovered human bones in the cave, as well as a few artifacts. And at that point, he contacted me, as he should have done under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and we began a process of notification and consultation with the tribes on the island. So on July 4th, 1996, the discovery was made, and that day Tim sent a message to me by radio. I went out there on the 5th of July and looked at the site, took possession of the human bones and the artifacts that had been found, and took them back to Craig with me that evening. That evening I notified the presidents of the Craig and Klawock tribal governments, Millie Stevens and Roseanne Demmert. And the following Monday morning I started working with Cheryl Eldemar at Tlingit and Haida Central Council. She was the NAGPRA coordinator at the time. And we started setting up a meeting in Klawock to begin the consultation process. That consultation began to happen on the Thursday following discovery, and in the Klawock Council chamber we had a meeting with most of the Klawock Council, some members of the Craig Council, and Charles Johnson from Cake, the organized village of Cake, came down. Resolutions were passed that week by the Craig and Klawock tribal governments supporting the further investigations at the cave and the study of the human remains and artifacts. The idea of internships was discussed, the idea of funding through the National Science Foundation internships for Native students. And we talked about communication and keeping the tribes up to date on what was going on at the site as the scientific investigations continued. So here are the artifacts that came from the cave, and these are a stone spear point, you can see there, that was found not too far away from the human bones. A little piece of bone, notched, that may be part of a harpoon point, and a longer piece of a rib bone that is a modified bone that's been shaped into some kind of a tool. We're not quite sure what. So those are the artifacts that were found the first week in 1996. And of course the human jaw was found that same time period, and we could tell some things pretty quickly from the jaw. We could tell this person was male by the thickness of the jawbone, and also there was a pelvis found too, and we could tell by the shape of the pelvis that it was male. We can tell by the eruption of the wisdom teeth that this is a person a little bit over 18 years old. One of the teeth was ground on the surface, and so that's usually a situation that happens in the early 20s. So we knew we had a young man who had died in a cave when he was about in his early 20s. And the radiocarbon date came back a few weeks later, and we knew that this person had died about 10,300 years ago. There's all the bones that were found through all the years of investigations. You can see we don't have the whole skeleton, just the jaw and part of the pelvis, a few vertebrae from the backbone, and a few ribs. The long bones and the crania are not. When people think about On Your Knees Cave after hearing the news and seeing it in various magazines, they think mostly about the human remains and human bones and probably think of it as a burial. But actually, of more importance to the archaeologists involved was the campsite located outside the cave. The paleontologists, after the first discovery, continued in future years to work in the cave looking at animal bones, and they found thousands upon thousands of animal bones in the cave of bear, marmot, fox, vole, even caribou, several other animals, ring seal, spanning over 40,000 years of animal use of the cave. And mixed into all that were a few pieces of human bone, the pieces that we just showed you. But outside the cave, the archaeologists focused their efforts on a trench that eventually produced over 4,000 archaeological samples, chips of stone and a few tools, things that resulted from the use and making of stone tools. And here you see a picture of the archaeological trench looking into the mouth of the archaeological profile here. You can see at the left, the white space is the entry chamber of the cave, and to the right side is the open air. And all those layers that you see are the layers of stuff that's fallen from the trees and off of the cliff and accumulated at the mouth of the cave over 10 or 11,000 years. And the red arrows are pointing at a dark layer that contains charcoal and ash and a lot of stone tools that were studied by the archaeologists. And these are some of the fancy tools, the bifaces, spear points, knives, those kinds of things that were recovered from that 10,300-year-old layer. You can see here the one at second from the left, the one with the white crust on it is the spear point that was found the first year. The darker section attached to the bottom of that is a piece that was found outside the cave in those layered sediments and dated by its association with some charcoal to about 10,300 years old. So we know that spear point was dated to just about the same time as the human bones that came from inside the cave. So that person or his group probably made most of these tools. Another type of artifact that was found in the cave is the microblades. Microblades are little slivers of glass or flint or quartzite that are broken into small straight pieces and inserted into grooves in the edge of bone or ivory tools. You can see the little inset on the left there and how we think they were used. One of the intriguing things about the obsidian tools is that we can get a chemical fingerprint from the sources of the obsidian, from the natural volcanic flows where the obsidian occurs, and match it with the archaeological tools, sort of match the fingerprints of the chemistry of the rocks. And in the case of On Your Knees Cave, we can see that most of the tools, 37 out of 40 that were analyzed, came from either Sumez Island, 75 miles south of On Your Knees Cave, or from Mounted Ziza, which is about 150 miles to the northeast, upland of the Stikine River. Both of those situations would require some sophisticated knowledge of where things are on the landscape, as well as some open water navigation skills and the use of watercraft. So we have some maritime adapted people here very early on in the prehistory of the Northwest Coast. One of the reasons that's really intriguing to archaeologists is because there's a large debate going on in the archaeological community about the peopling of the Americas and where the first people came and what routes they took and where they came from. And here on the Northwest Coast, we talk a lot about the coastal migration hypothesis. And so that idea of a maritime adapted people seems to be supported by what we're finding here on Your Knees Cave. So the idea would be that we have fishermen or sea mammal hunters in northeastern Asia moving around the Pacific Rim along the coast of the Bering Land Bridge and down into Alaska, southeast Alaska, and the rest of the Americas, following a coastal route rather than the inland route that had been more popularly theorized in past years. In December 2000, National Geographic did a spread on different theories of the You can see the spear point and the bears and the ring seal. Y-chromosome DNA work by Brian Kemp and colleagues. Brian is now with Washington State University and published an article in 2007 that's really groundbreaking in terms of ideas about peopling of the Americas. Brian looked at the similarities in mitochondrial DNA and in Y-chromosome DNA. That's maternal DNA and paternal. And by looking at the mitochondrial DNA, Brian determined that the On Your Knees Cave remains were of a genetic group called haplogroup D. And within haplogroup D, they were further determined that the lineage is D4H3. And that was a group of research by a person named Tam, who did that a little bit later than Brian did, got the D4H3 lineage identified. And this map shows the connections of that D4H3 lineage from On Your Knees Cave and other matches, 47 matches in the Americas. Take note of the one in Southern California, as well as a whole alignment of them down the west coast of the Americas. A little more evidence for the coastal migration hypothesis. Just a few people pictures, things that happened out at the cave. Everything that came from the cave was carefully provenienced. That is, its three-dimensional location was recorded and entered into a computer. And here's Eric was our computer specialist. The internship program that I talked about earlier did happen, and one of the interesting outcomes here is Sabrina Demert was perhaps the first intern to be placed with the project by the Klawock Cooperative Association. This was the year that Sabrina graduated from high school. Sabrina now teaches at the high school as an English teacher, and she actually teaches my kids, so there's a real nice little circle there. Patrick Olson was an intern selected by Sea Alaska. Sea Alaska took over the funding of the internship program under their natural resources intern program in 1998, 99, and 2000. And Patrick was a Sea Alaska intern for 2 years, 98 and 99. He's at the University of Idaho as an instructor now. Yarrow Vara of Kloak was the intern with the project for the longest amount of time. Yarrow was, in the second half of the first year, she worked under the National Science Foundation internship program, and then she was selected by Sea Alaska to be one of their interns for 2 years following that. So she was in the field with us for 3 years and actually gave a talk at the National Archaeological Meetings one year on studying my ancestors was the topic of her talk. Here's Yarrow being photographed by Ken Garrett of National Geographic. She really was in a kind of an interesting position there as a young Native woman on the site where controversial studies of human remains were being done, and she was asked some tough questions. And to her credit, she came up with some very graceful answers and deflected the questions back to the tribal councils and the elders in Kloak. So when the science was done and the field work was finished, the Kloak Cooperative Association and the Craig Community Association submitted a claim for under NAGPRA for the human remains and objects discovered in 1996. And the rationale for the claim was that the Tlingit people had been in this area since time immemorial, and that these remains must be Tlingit. So there was the cultural affiliation was an obvious conclusion to come to. They also stated strongly that this On Your Knees cave is located within the traditional territory of the Tlingit people. In the statement, it was stated that Tlingit people have a tradition of learning from their ancestors, a tradition called Ha-Shagun, and also that the identity of Tlingit people comes from their association with places on the landscape and with the land, a principle referred to as Ha-Ani. And so these two principles are at the root of the claim. In analyzing the claim, the first thing that I had to do as a representative of the Forest Service was determine that these remains were Native American, because the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act refers only to remains that are related to a tribe, people, or culture indigenous to the United States of America, including Alaska and Hawaii. So not Canada, not Mexico, indigenous to the United States. And so I used Brian Kemp's mitochondrial DNA studies in the following way. Brian stated that the mitochondrial DNA analyzed from On Your Knees cave remains belongs to one of the maternal lineages carried by humans from Asia to the Americas approximately 15,000 years ago. At the time of the publication, Kemp and colleagues were unsure of what the precise lineage was to be called. In this case, they knew only that it belonged to mitochondrial haplogroup D. However, in a later study, Tam and colleagues determined that the On Your Knees cave lineage is called D4H3. Today, some members of the Chumash tribe, located in the Santa Barbara area of California, belong to the D4H3 lineage. Therefore, there is a connection between the remains from On Your Knees cave and an indigenous Native American group. He is Native American. And here's that map again that shows the matches between the On Your Knees cave mitochondrial DNA and Native American samples that were studied during Kemp's study. And again, you can see that Chumash match there, where 4 of the 47 matches were with the Chumash people of Southern California. So the decision was that first we looked at the objects, and unfortunately the objects, the human remains were located in a context within the cave that did not indicate that it was a burial. There were only fragmented pieces of the skeleton represented, as I showed you earlier, and the depositional context of the situation was that they had been water deposited and reworked and disturbed, and so there was no evidence that it was a grave, therefore it was not a funerary object. None of the items were funerary objects. There was no claim made that these were sacred items or that they were items of cultural patrimony, And so we determined that the objects did not meet the definitions in NAGPRA and were not eligible for transfer of custody. On the other hand, the human remains are Native American, and the discovery is located on the lands determined to be the aboriginal territories of the Tlingit people by the U.S. Court of Claims and reaffirmed by the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971. So I didn't feel that the argument for cultural affiliation would stand up to the rigor of a courtroom discussion, and we had a very strong case for the aboriginal territory of the Tlingit people. And so on those grounds, we transferred custody of the human remains. Those are the objects that were considered, by the way. So on June 4th and June 11th of 2007, the Forest Service advertised its intent to transfer custody of the remains to the Klawock and Craig tribal governments. We advertised them twice and then waited 30 days, receiving no counterclaims or objections. On August 20th, 2007, the Forest Service, the Forest Supervisor, signed the documents transferring legal custody of the remains to the tribal governments of Klawock and Craig. And on June 26, 2008, the tribal governments formally took possession of the remains, removing them from the Forest Service's safe. So, after transfer of custody at the end of 2007, the Klawock and Craig tribal councils formed a committee to figure out what to do with the remains now that they had been transferred. And the idea was to rebury them and to have a celebration or a ceremony that basically brought the whole situation to conclusion. The partners in that committee were the Klawock Cooperative Association, the Craig Community Association, Sea Alaska Corporation, and Sea Alaska Heritage Institute, as well as the Tongass National Forest. The committee did its work over a period of about several months, from November 2007 through September 2008. And on September 25th, 2008, the human remains were placed in a box. The box had a red cedar liner that had been woven by Debbie Head of Craig, and it was placed in a bentwood box that had been constructed by John Rowan of Klawock, master carver of Klawock. The remains were placed in a grave on an undisclosed location on Prince of Wales Island. Bob Sam of Sitka came to the island at the request of the Klawock Cooperative Association and acted as a protocol advisor for the event. The event was simple, and it was not ceremonial really in a traditional or in a modern Christian sense. It was a respectful placement and return of the person to the ground. And to paraphrase Bob, he said, we did what any human being would do for any other human being. We treated him with respect, and we placed him back. We returned him to his homeland. And it was as simple as that. The headstone at the bottom right was placed on top of the grave. That was carved by Stone Arts of Alaska in Craig and commissioned by Sea Alaska Corporation. And then the Shuká honor ceremony was held on September 26th and 27th. And the purpose of the honor ceremony was to honor the life of this man who died 10,000 years ago, to honor the knowledge gained through his study, and to honor the partnerships and relationships formed in the 14 years since the discovery. The part of the event that I took charge of was kind of an educational presentations that happened in the afternoons of the 2 days, Friday and Saturday. And the scientists who had come back to be part of the Shuká honor ceremony, Jim Dixon, the archaeologist now with the University of New Mexico, Tim Heaton with the University of South Dakota, Brian Kemp with the Washington State University, and myself with the Forest Service were joined by Bob Sam, and we all gave presentations at the Klawock and Craig high schools on the Friday and Saturday to explain to people what had gone on over the course of this long study and what we were doing this weekend and why it was important to everybody. was really well attended. During those events, we also showed Kawut Yazain. His spirit is looking out from the cave, which is a 25-minute video that was produced by the Alaska Heritage Institute and is available on their website. So if you missed the talk, you can. The honor ceremony itself was 2 days of feasting and celebrating and speeches and thank yous and awards and gifts, and it was a ceremony that honored all of us that had been part of this endeavor over its long history, as well as the knowledge that we had gained and the values that it had conveyed to the people who had been involved. And here, Debbie Head's some of Debbie Head's students from the Craig School District are picking through Labrador tea. They're making gifts to be handed out at the ceremonies and at the dinners. During the ceremonies, we fed about 1,500 meals to about 600 people. People came in from all over Southeast Alaska. We had state government representatives, tribal leaders, clan leaders, Forest Service leaders, even the Secretary of Agriculture and some of his staff came to be part of the program. Here are just a few scenes. You can see there that's part of the red cedar liner that Debbie wove to be part of the burial box. And the meals were hosted by the Prince of Wales Islands Veterans Association, the Chamber of Commerce, the Forest Service, the A and B chapters, A and S chapters were a big part of the program. People had a chance to talk over the course of 2 days and get together and share their ideas and impressions about what had been going on over these 14 years of study and opportunities that we might have to work together in the future. People let down their hair a little bit and were joined in the ceremonies and the celebrations. Here the Denny Bashore, the regional forester, and the Secretary of Agriculture are dancing with the Cape Fox dancers in the Cloak Gym while the dignitaries in the back look on. One thing I really wanted to do that I just don't have time to is to thank everybody involved in this, not only for the involvement in the Shuká honor ceremony, but for 14 years of support for this project and interest in the project. It was amazing to me to see the amount of interest and knowledge that people had gained about this project. All these different organizations come out of the communities and out of the schools and out of the various tribal and governmental organizations to support and be part of this Shuká honor ceremony. First Bank actually contributed a lot to the ceremony in terms of funding for the meals and in terms of reimbursing volunteer groups for some of their time that they put into this. All these other organizations contributed prizes and money and food and a variety of other things. I just wanted to put these people's names up on the screen so you can see the amount of support there was. There's John Rowan on the left there, who was the master carver who carved the burial box and had been a behind-the-scenes participant in this project since the very beginning. John is a good friend of mine and someone I often go to get a feel on how people are feeling about what I'm doing. And so there he is with the Secretary of Agriculture and his wife, Patty. Elders were part of this, not only giving talks at the evening meals, but also saying the blessings for the various meals and parts of the ceremonies. And so I just want to say thank you for everybody for your support for this project over the years and for your interest in it. And I hope that we can build on this experience and use it as a bridge to other productive relationships and endeavors that link us all together in the future. Thank you very much. And please give me a call if you have anything you'd like to talk about here. Thank you again.
Emily Moore is a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, where she studies American and Native American art. She was raised in Ketchikan and interested in Tlingit and Haida art, and is researching a dissertation on the CCC totem parks of the New Deal. Oh.
Steve, you've been preempted. Just for a few minutes. Walter Porter, you want to come forward? Is there other planning committee members? Nora Dauenhauer, you want to stand with us for a minute? We're going to just take a couple of minutes, and we really wanted to recognize Steve Henrikson as a strong component to the Tlingit Tribes and Clans Conference Planning Committee organization. He has been exemplary, and quite frankly, sometimes when you give a gift, it's out of guilt for the kinds of things that we didn't feel like we stood up far enough and enough to. But also, more importantly, it's out of paying the respect that Steve is due. He wasn't aware that we were going to do this, and so we want to take a moment in between his presentations to give him some recognition, especially among the colleagues that are here in the room today, because you probably know the kind of person and the kind of integrity that Steve Henrikson is just in his natural day-to-day life. And we could not wait another minute, and so we apologize for you on taking a few minutes in between presentations, but we know there's another slideshow that is critically important, so we're not going to take too much time. But I wanted to call on Sergei Kan to say a couple of words.
Thank you, Gerry. Steve, you worked very hard. In fact, I often wondered how the Alaska State Museum is still keeping you. We felt like this was your main job, and the museum was your moonlighting. And we felt that Janice, your wife, was really tolerant. And I heard that she now communicates with you only by email. So you'll have to do some atonement when you get home. But you can blame us. You really worked hard, and I think without you, this conference really would not have been possible. So, on behalf of your friends, will be presenting you with a check. It's about $430, and I'm going to read the names of your colleagues and friends, and I emphasize the friends who've contributed, and it includes Gerry Hope, Dick and Nora Dauenhauer, myself, Walter Porter, Peter Metcalfe, Marcia Hodge, Jim Simard, Eric Hollinger, Anna Marie Strankman, and Marie Olson. And they all signed this certificate. Oh, I'm sorry. I left out Kim Metcalfe. My apology. And we're not, you can do whatever you want with this money. You can go to Vegas. You can hire dancing girls, but you can spend on books. But our gift certificate, we have this very nice printing job. You'll recognize the quality. It's Peter's colleague, Sue. Mm-hmm. And it says, in recognition of Steve Henrikson for his contribution to sharing our knowledge, a conference of Tlingit Tribes and Clans, Juneau, Alaska, March 2009. The gift intended for the purchase of a work of Alaska Native art is given in recognition of the countless hours Steve Henrikson devoted to the organization of over 100 presenters at nearly 40 workshops and plenary sessions over a 4-day conference. So you can purchase Native art for yourself or for your dear, beautiful wife. That's really up to you. What? And I have a small gift for you as well. Last night I gave you a book I edited on adoption of anthropologists by Native people but I also have this very beautiful special Dartmouth keychain, and I thought it's appropriate because the Dartmouth motto is Vox clamantis in deserto. So you are the voice in the wilderness. And I think during the preparation for the conference, on occasion you felt like you were the voice in the wilderness, where the other planning committee members were not responding to your voice. But I think we sometimes felt in the morning we opened the email box, and there's another 200th email from Steve Henrikson, and you really don't want to start your day with another email from Steve Henrikson, that voice from the wilderness of Juneau. But it's also a very nice keychain, so I guess it means that the next collection I'm going to be taking in 2011 will be for a Ferrari or maybe a Jaguar.
Irene Dundas, come stand with us. She's part of the planning committee too.
Right.
And other planning committee members that are there, I think Marcia's next door though, but others, you need to assume your responsibility as a planning committee member and come forward. We shouldn't have to invite you.
Some people want to contribute, but they were busy with other things. So you have more friends than me.
And so, as you see, Sergei wants to talk some more. But Steve, we didn't want to escape your opportunity to respond. Please give Steve Henrikson a hand.
Oh, well, it's been really an honor to work on this project, and I have enjoyed working with everyone on the committee. I've learned a lot from them and have thoroughly enjoyed the whole event, and have a lot of good memories of this. And I would like to also thank my wife for putting up with this, and so finally maybe tonight I can get a full night of sleep after several weeks of going nonstop. But it's been an honor to work with you guys. Thank you very much. So I think in the interest of time, though, we better forge ahead, and I'll finish my introduction of Emily Moore. Thank you for your patience here. I was saying that she was raised in Ketchikan and is interested in Tlingit and Haida art. She's researching a dissertation on the Civilian Conservation Corps totem pole project of the New Deal era. And this paper this morning grows out of a paper written for the Bill Holmes Center for a forthcoming publication on contemporary Northwest Coast Native art to be published by the Burke Museum. Emily?
Well, good morning. I too wanted to thank Steve Henrikson for organizing this panel and for all of his work on the conference. I also wanted to acknowledge Irene Dundas, whose great work for all the repatriation efforts I'm going to reference here. I won't actually describe that repatriation effort, but I encourage you all to listen to the talk she gave in Sitka, I believe in 2007. That was a really amazing story of the work she did to repatriate these items for the Sanya Kwan. I want to acknowledge the Akwan peoples of Juneau for letting us have this conference on their land. I also wanted to thank Nathan Jackson and Stephen Jackson for answering so many of my questions, and all of the examples you'll hear today are based on the totem poles and house posts that they carved. So the talk today is actually about what happens after repatriation, but we're going to start back for a moment in time. In July of 1899, SS George W. Elder anchored off the shore of the Tlingit village of Gosh, known in English as Cape Fox, and landed a party on the beach. These were the members of the Harriman Expedition, a group of scientists and personal friends of the railroad magnate Edward H. Harriman, who funded a 2-month trip through Alaska for, quote, advancing science, unquote, and for hunting big game. At Cape Fox, the Harriman Expedition was ecstatic to find what it believed was an abandoned Indian village, and in the name of science, set about removing dozens of items of Tlingit at.oow. These included 4 totem poles, 4 house posts, the entire house front of the Take-Waity grizzly bear house, several box drums, bentwood boxes, and masks. The Harriman Expedition sailed these at.oow to Seattle and later donated the items to museums across the United States, fulfilling Harriman's goal that the 1899 expedition would, quote, gather useful information and distribute it for the benefit of others, unquote. And here you can see 2 Take-Waity brown bear posts as they appeared in the Burke Museum in the 1950s, attempting to be useful information for others. In 1990, nearly 100 years after the Harriman Expedition arrived at Cape Fox, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. NAGPRA turned the tables on collecting practices like Harriman's and asserted the right of Native peoples to protect and direct their own cultural patrimony. It required that museums receiving federal funding notify Native groups of the objects or burial remains in their collections, and to return those items to which the tribes or clans were culturally affiliated. As a result of this law, 6 of the poles and house posts that the Harriman Expedition had stolen in 1899 were returned to the Sanya-Kwan, whose descendants now live primarily in Saxman and Ketchikan. So here you can see in 2001 2 of the Take-Waity posts that had been in the Burke Museum returning to Ketchikan. And I should mention that these were actually brought by boat by the Harriman Expedition Retraced, which was a group of scholars who are retracing that 1899 route to study the changes in Alaska over 100 years. So in some ways this came full circle. The repatriation of the Sanya-Kwan at.oow is an important success story of NAGPRA, but it is what happened next for these poles that is the focus of my paper this morning. In an act rooted in the Tlingit tradition of balance or reciprocation, Cape Fox Corporation, the village corporation for the Sanya-Kwan, gifted a cedar log to each of the museums that had returned at.oow to Saxman. In turn, the museums, many of which were seeking ways to improve their relationship with Tlingits, responded to the gift of the Sanya-Kwan by commissioning Tlingit master carver Nathan Jackson, and later his son Stephen Jackson, to carve the cedar log into a new pole that could rightly stand in their galleries. From 2000 to 2007, the Jacksons created 5 poles and house posts for the Harvard Peabody Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., the Burke Museum at the University of Washington in Seattle, and most recently, the Field Museum in Chicago. These stunning new poles were not copies of the at.oow that they replaced, as we will see. Instead, they honored the original pole's crest story with a new interpretation that asserted a Tlingit view of history in the museum. The practice of carving a pole for a museum to acknowledge a pole the museum returned is a significant outcome of NAGPRA and its meeting with Northwest Coast traditions of balance and reciprocation. The practice is not limited to the Jacksons. In 2007, a Heisla artist in British Columbia carved a totem pole for Sweden's Museum of Ethnography, following that museum's return of an original Heisla pole taken by a Swedish explorer in the early 20th century. While some objects have been voluntarily exchanged between Native groups and museums in the past, the growing number of examples of objects commissioned to replace repatriated property is a practice that deserves attention and perhaps a name. And this is where my strange invented word comes in. I'd like to suggest the term propatriation, which, although imperfect as a Latin word, may serve our purposes here. The reverse of repatriation, which is the returning of an object or person to its homeland or patria, propatriation is the sending forth of an object or entity from its patria or homeland, usually an acknowledgment of an object or entity returned. It plays on multiple meanings of the prefix pro, including forth or forward, for the sake of, in return for, and even pro as in being pro something, as in pro clinket. All of these meanings work to frame propatriation as a reciprocative act that acknowledges the return of new entities and describes the sending forth of entities that assert a clinket worldview. And here I should note also that on the Northwest Coast, where groups are matrilineal, we probably should be saying promatriation, but in order to keep that dialogue with repatriation, I went for propatriation. Propatriation marks a new set of possibilities in the NAGPRA era, both in terms of Native relationships with museums and in terms of contemporary Native art. Unlike at.oow that was wrongfully removed from Natives, like the Sanya-Kwan of Cape Fox, propatriated objects are specifically made for the museum, created by commissioned Native artists with the intent that they will proclaim a Native presence in the gallery space. Propatriation swaps out the diverted spoils of a colonial past for art that Native peoples specifically designed for the museum. At the same time, it honors the histories of the at.oow that they replace by the very act of acknowledging their return. Finally, I would like to suggest that the Jackson's propatriated poles, which you can see here, embodies the Tlingit concept of ha-shuká or ha-shagun, the idea of heritage and destiny, ancestor and successor that informs a Tlingit view of generational unity. So I'm just going to go through some of these examples of what I'm calling propatriated poles. The earliest of the Harriman Expedition poles to return to the Sanya-Kwan was this Tequati brown bear pole from the Harvard Peabody Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Cape Fox Corporation submitted a repatriation request for this pole in 1999, and the Peabody returned it in 2000, and Cape Fox Corporation donated a cedar log to the museum that same year. Patricia Capone, the assistant curator at the Harvard Peabody, told me that, quote, "The clear choice was to work together with a Tlingit artist to create a revitalized pole, symbol of the new relationship between our museum and the Sanya-Kwan peoples." And because Nathan had already carved, you can see this panel that he did up above, he had already carved that in the 1970s, so the museum approached him to do this pole. Now you can see the old pole on the left, the original pole from Cape Fox that the Harriman Expedition removed, and you can see Nathan's new pole on the right. Obviously, this was not a replica of the old pole, and Nathan made a concerted decision not to replicate the at.oow. And when I asked him about that choice, he said, quote, "I felt that the original pole was the original pole. I would make a rendition of my own." Nathan's emphasis on remaining faithful to the Tequati crest stories of the brown bear, rather than to its exact physical representation, honors Tlingit belief that it is the right to an origin story, crest, name, song, or other object of at.oow that matters more than a physical representation of it. It also represents a refusal to provide the Peabody Museum with a copy of at.oow that had never been rightfully purchased in the Tlingit definition of the word, nor recognized at a potlatch as the museum's owned or purchased thing. So he's really refusing to give back that Cape Fox at.oow, and instead he's honoring that Tequati story of cots. What I like especially about these propatriated poles is that they're often provided context for the whole story. And here at the Harvard Peabody, you can see there's wall text and a film that was made to describe the entire process by which these poles were made in Cape Fox, later taken by the Harriman Expedition, given to the Peabody Museum, and then returned to the Sanya-Kwan peoples. So this history is really acknowledged in the museum. It's discussed, unlike when the Cape Fox pole originally stood there. In 2004, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, or NMAI, dedicated a new pole by Nathan, who had been helped by his wife Dorica and assisted by his son Stephen. Their pole replaced a 44-foot freestanding totem pole repatriated to the Sanya Kwan, which, like the Peabody pole, also belonged to the Tequati clan, and again told the story of Kats. And I'm sorry I don't have a picture of the original pole here. This Smithsonian pole has ironically been one of the most difficult for me to research. But I do know that Nathan again chose to depart from the original pole, instead offering his own design by stacking 3 bear cubs above Kats and his bear wife. The painting on the back of this pole also references an aspect of the Kats story that is not often depicted, that at the end of the story, when the bear wife, bereaving over her dead husband, cries the mournful song of the loon. And there you can see they painted a loon on the back of the pole. Of all the propatriated poles carved by Nathan and Stephen Jackson, this one makes the least impact in terms of telling a Tlingit history. This is largely because of its location, although beautifully framed in the glass niche, I can show you there, which was specifically designed in the architecture to house it. The pole's place in the corner of the Smithsonian gift shop compromises somewhat its power. The only way to view the pole from the front is by entering the gift shop, where one becomes distracted by many opportunities to buy. Further, this pole is the least contextualized of the 5 propatriated poles by the Jacksons, and at least when I was at NMAI 2 years ago, there was only a plaque telling who the artists were and the title of the pole. There was no description of the history of the Harriman Expedition and the repatriation of those poles. So in some ways, I think this was a missed opportunity, given that this is the National Museum on the Capitol Mall, to tell a Tlingit history. In contrast, the 2 house posts dedicated in 2004 at the Burke Museum demonstrate the potential of propatriation to assert a Tlingit point of view. For the first time, Nathan and Stephen were commissioned separately, each to create a house post to replace 2 posts of the story of Kats that had been returned as stolen property. And I should say that Robin Wright told me that this was Rosita Worrell's suggestion when they were on the Harriman Expedition Retraced boat, that Rosita had suggested, well, why not have both Nathan and Stephen create one of the house posts, since you have 2. Nathan's rendition of the Kat story differs from the Gosh post on several fronts. He shortened the snout of the bear, since he felt that the long nose of the Gosh post could have been mistaken for a wolf. And instead of the small inverted human figure caught with outstretched hands in the great bear's mouth, Nathan chose to depict the hunter Kats upright in his bear wife's embrace. The man stands between her hind legs, his arms wrapped around her knees, her paws cupping his shoulders. Here the intertwining of bear and human bodies harmonizes, and Stephen has actually joked that his father's pole represents the honeymoon between Kats and his wife before things went bad. Nathan also departed from the original paint scheme on the Gash post, applying black, red, and blue-green latex paints far more sparingly than the original post had, and this allows him to show that beautiful ads work that he often does. If Nathan departed from the Gash post in his reinterpretation for the Burke, Stephen's house post veered in a completely new direction. In technique, form, and subject matter, this post asserts a radically different presence than the Cape Fox post that it replaces. Stephen chose to depict in epoxy resin the Kat story's violent climax, where the bear children tear their father to pieces for having betrayed their mother. In a composition that Stephen has described as, quote, multiple exposures of Kat's dismemberment and death, fingers drip with bloody sinews, ligaments strain, and intestine-like forms writhe across the surface of the post. But if one accuses this post of abandoning Northwest Coast design completely, note that there are still ovoids here. I don't have my laser pointer, and even U-forms of the intestine-like guts. I would even argue, I don't know if Bill Holmes here and would let me get away with this, but that the swirl of intestine and sinew recalls the role of the primary form line, which, in Bill Holmes' classic definition, serves to create, quote, a continuous flowing grid over the whole decorated area, unquote. What I find most exciting about these poles is their insistence on evoking the violence that came to Cape Fox with the Harriman Expedition, and even earlier with missionaries and traders. Stephen has flatly stated that his choice to depict Cott's bloody dismemberment was a choice to insist on the violence wrought on Tlingit culture by colonization, a violence he wants discussed in the museum. And I really think this is happening every time I've been studying these posts at the Burke. Some child or person in a school group has come over to Stephen's pole and said something like, "Mom, what is this?" And that inquiry then results in a reading of the text that's beside these poles, a discussion of the Harriman Expedition, the removal of poles, the repatriation of poles. This history is really finally being told in the museum. It's being discussed, and I think that's what's exciting about it. So the final pole that I'll discuss is at the Field Museum in Chicago. In April 2007, the Field Museum unveiled the first pole to fuse the work of father and son in a single work of cedar and epoxy resin. As at the Burke Museum, curators at the Field understood that the Jackson pole would not be a replica of the Gosh pole it was intended to replace. And in fact, Helen Robbins, the project director for the Field, told me that she wanted to ensure the new pole would blend traditional and modern elements of Tlingit design. To create the design for the Field Museum, Stephen ran photographs of his father's pole from the Harvard Peabody Museum through a morphing logarithm in Photoshop. The resulting curve and torque represents, as Stephen states, quote, the refraction or bending of traditional Tlingit culture that occurred during a turbulent history of cultural loss and recovery, unquote. The verticality associated with the totem pole is here compromised by a strong diagonal swoop, as Stephen calls it, the composition churning across its surface. Nathan redrew the original crests of the Nech'ari pole back into Stephen's design, and I'm afraid I have this horrible picture here of the original pole, but you can see the eagle, raven, and bear that were the original crests on the pole, and Nathan redrew those crests even into this morphed design. The Jackson's pole retains the eagle, bear, and raven, honoring the Nech'ari pole which it replaces, but it does not preserve their composition. Instead of the assured vertical stacking of the bear, raven, and eagle, the crests are now subsumed in the strong torque of the pole itself. The raven and eagle wedged into the spaces allotted to them, the bear the stalwart vestige of the Nech'ari crest, yet obscured by the wing of the eagle. Following Stephen's lead, one might read these crests as survivors, emerging from the torque of history and from Photoshop manipulations, in an altered state that is nevertheless a testimony to creative renewal and continuation. And here you can see some of Stephen's work. This pole is really impressive in the museum because as you enter this great hall called the Alsdorf Hall of Northwest Coast Native Peoples, it's this bright beacon of kind of contemporary art in an otherwise, a room otherwise dedicated to pre-contact cultures. The propatriation of Tlingit poles to major museums across the United States marks a new site for contemporary Native art and a new phase for Native relationships with museums. Stephen has even said that he is considering a new grant project that would pay for the repatriation of a post or pole just to enable him to replace it with a propatriated pole of his own. So I think that this practice could grow, and I would find it an exciting practice. It is an exciting practice to intervene in a museum that once held what it should not, to replace what was wrongfully taken with what is decidedly given to assert a Tlingit worldview. In each of these museums, Tlingit dancing, song, and speeches accompanied the Jackson Pole's debut, marking the space in terms of Tlingit protocol and affirmation. Unlike the Cape Fox posts, which has stood in these museums as testaments to the quote-unquote vanishing Indian that the Harriman Expedition believed they'd traced, the Jackson posts stand as a renewed testament of Tlingit culture, looking back to the crest stories that they honor and asserting a future for Tlingit history in the museum. Thank you.